This is a walkthrough of the Demo Express lowdb passport repo. In this repo, I created a simple Express app that uses lowdb as the database and passport to handle authentication. So we'll go to step 1. Each of these steps is a separate branch, so you would just do git checkout step 1, git checkout step 2. So in step 1, we're just connecting to the database and displaying the two books in the database. So what lowdb is, it's a database that reads a JSON file on your computer. The cool thing about lowdb is that it stores information in a JSON file, and you can directly add, edit, and delete items in the JSON file, and that will be reflected when you make your queries. So instead of writing separate queries to create, delete, and update items in the database, all you have to do is edit your db.json file. So for this db.json file, I'm going to commit it to Git, and it's going to be uploaded to GitHub. The db.json file will also be uploaded to the server when I deploy the app. So in this example, you can see that I have two books and two authors. And to connect to the database, all you have to do is require lowdb and then list the path to your database file. And in my case, I put it in the data/db.json. And on the books route, in order to get all the books, all I have to do is call get books and value, and then pass books into the template. In the template, I'm just looping over each book and displaying the title. So then you end up with a list of book titles when you go to books. So now on to step 2. And I'm just going to grab one book from the database and display it. So I added a new route where I get the ID passed in through the URL, and then I look for a book whose ID matches the ID passed through the URL. If that book exists, I'm going to look up the author for that book through here, where I'm looking through the authors field, and then I'm going to find the ID that equals the author ID from the book. And then I passed the book and the author to the template. Because this isn't a relational database, I have to make a separate call to look through the books and look through the authors. I can't do a join. I added a link, and then when you click on a book, you will see the book and the author. And now I'm going to go to step 3. And in step 3, I've created a form in order to create a new book. And because I'm adding a form, I needed to add body parser to deal with the form data. And in the previous books route, I'm also grabbing all the authors because I want to, for this drop-down menu, I want to list all the authors. And then I added a form on the books template. The action goes to a route called create books using the post method. So just an input field for the name, and then I added a drop-down menu that lists all the authors. In the create route, I get data from the form, and then I insert it into the database. And lowdb, in order to insert a new record, you use the command push. So I'm pushing the title, and UUID is a library that creates a unique string that you can use for IDs. And I'm doing that because if I was using a relational database, I could use an auto-generated ID. But since I'm not using a relational database, I need to generate my own ID. So the only thing I'm saving is the title, the ID, and the author ID. And then after I create the book, then I redirect. So I'm going to create a new book. Book 3, author 2. So this creates a new book, and then it redirects to books, and then as you can see, I have a new book. So that covers some basic commands you can do with lowdb, which is select all items, select one item given a certain field, and how to create new items. And there are other commands that you can use for deleting and updating, and more commands for querying. So if you want to learn more, read the documentation. So now on to step 4, and I created a separate routes file to hold all the routes because the app JS file is going to get big with all the login stuff, so I decided to move into separate routes file. So on to step 5. So in step 5, we are adding a sign-up form where people can sign up for a new account, and when they sign up, we create a new user and add it to the database. So I added 2 new routes, one which is the get sign up route, which displays the sign up form. Handle the form submission post route, which I'm taking the data from the form, trimming it to remove the extra white space, and I'm passing certain pieces of information to this sign up function from the auth service. And the information is the username, password, the URL I want to be redirected after the person signs up, and then the template that we're using for the sign up. So this is the auth service sign up form, and I'm making certain assumptions in this demo. I'm assuming that people are storing the users in the users table, and that people are using the username and password as the 2 fields for the login. So I need to grab all the usernames stored in the database, and I'm also checking if the username that the user signed up with already exists in the database. And if that username already exists in the database, I'm just going to show the user an error telling them that the username is already taken. And if the username doesn't exist, then I'm going to create a new user. And to create a new user, I just you go to the users table, use the push command to add a username and a new ID with a random UUID. Instead of saving the plain text password in the database, I'll save a random string that will be something like this. And that's because you don't want to save plain text password in your database, because that's a bad idea. And the hash of password uses the bcrypt library to create a hash. So after I create the user, then I'll redirect. So when you run the app, you see the sign up form. So after it creates a user, it redirects to the home page, and it also adds a new user to the db.json file. So let's go to step 6. And in step 6, I'm going to add validation to the form. So in order to validate the form, I'm using Express Validator to do that. So I have to add that to app.js, and then I have to declare that I'm using the Express Validator. And right before the routes, I've defined some global variables that I want to be available to all the views. So in order to define variables that are in the views, you use response.locals and then the name of the variable. So here what I'm saying is, in my views, I'm going to be able to access this variable called errors, and right now I'm just setting the value to null. What Express Validator does is that it comes with certain rules, and if the data that's submitted doesn't match those rules, it will create an error. So some of the rules that I added was I want the username and password to be at least 3 characters, and I want them to be required, which you use with not empty. And I also want the confirm password to be the same as the password field. I'm going to call validation errors to check for errors, and if there are any errors, I'm going to re-render the sign up page and display the errors on screen. So to display the errors in the sign up form, I added a new code, which if there are any errors, I'm going to loop through all the errors and display them. So now when I go to sign up form and submit an empty form, all the errors are displayed. So now in step 7, now that we've created the users, I'm going to add Passport to handle logging in the users and logging them out. So when you install Passport, you actually need to install a couple other libraries. You need the cookie parser that handles cookies, and Express Sessions, which will handle sessions. And a session is when the server keeps track of certain key value pairs. They can either store this information in memory, or they can store this information in a database. And I also added another library, the .env library. So the reason I installed .env was because sessions require a secret, and instead of hard coding the secret files and then checking that secret into Git and then uploading it to GitHub, I can use the .env file to store the secret, and then Git ignore the .env file so that it doesn't get stored in GitHub. And I also created a .env sample file which contains secret keys and some values, but these are fake values. These aren't the real values that I'm using for my application. So here's my config environment files where I'm saying if I'm in development, I want to use the .env library. So you have to do certain things to set up the sessions, and I copy these settings from the Express Sessions documentation. Then I have to use the sessions, and then I have to initialize Passport. So in app views, I'm Also adding a variable called users that will be available in all the templates, and what that will be set to is the request user. When you log in with Passport, it adds a user object to the request, and that has information about the logged in user. So now I want that information about the logged in user available to all the views. And I added two routes. One, which is the get login, which will display the login page, and then I added a post login, which will handle the form submission. And to handle the form submission, I'm going to use Passport authenticate method. So for Passport authenticate, you pass in some information. First is the type of strategy you're using. I'm using the local strategy, which means that I'm checking the username and password that's stored in my database. Other strategies include using OAuth for third-party providers such as Twitter and Facebook. And I'm also passing in the route that I want to be redirected to after a user logs in, and I also want to list the route that the user gets redirected to if the login fails. And I also added a route to handle the logging out. So all a person has to do to log out is call this request logout function, which comes from Passport. And after they log out, they're redirected. So in my auth service, I'm requiring the Passport local strategy, which, as I mentioned before, is what handles username and password that are saved in a database. And to configure Passport, you have to do a couple steps. And what Passport does is that when we create a session, it adds the user information to that session. And in this serialize user function, you determine what user information you're saving into the session. And for that, I'm just using the user ID. So what Passport does is it adds a user object to each request, and you can determine what information is stored in that user object. And to determine what information we store in that user object, we use the deserialize user. So we use the deserialize users. It's going to read the ID that's stored in the session. Then I'm going to look for a user with that ID in the database. And if that user ID exists, I'm going to pass in the ID and username. So now whenever I use request user, I'm going to get back the ID and username. Another thing to do when you set up Passport is you have to define what strategy to use. One is the local strategy, and that handles username and password that is stored in your database. Other ones include OAuthing with third-party services like Twitter and Facebook. So here I'm telling Passport that I'm going to use the local strategy, and then in this function I also have to define what happens when Passport's login function is executed. So after I'm going to look for the user in the database, and if the user isn't found, I'm going to return an error message. So the done callback has three arguments. You can pass in whether or not you have errors, the results, and any extra data you want to send. So in this case, when a user is not found, there are no errors, but I didn't get any results, so that's false. But I do want to pass in a message saying that the username and password is invalid. If the username is in the database, now I want to check if the password that they submitted matches the password in the database. So I have this other function, compare password. And that checks, and that uses bcrypts compare of a sync function which compares the plain text password with the hash password. So if the password doesn't match, then I'm going to return another error message. And I like to keep my error messages kind of vague, where I'm just saying it's invalid username and password, invalid username and password for both when the user isn't found and when the password doesn't match. And some people, they use separate error messages for the two error conditions. When the username isn't found, they return an error message that the username isn't found. And if the password doesn't match, they tell the users your password doesn't match. And the reason why that's a problem is that you're giving people too much information about the data that's stored in your database. So if I was trying to break into the site and I type in a username and I get back the message that this username doesn't exist in the database, then I know, well, I can just keep randomly guessing at a username until I find one that exists in the database. And then once I found a username that actually exists in the database, then I can keep on guessing a password. But if you pass in the same error message for both the username failure and the password failure, then when people enter in a random username and password, they don't know which of the fields they got wrong. So that makes it harder for them to guess at a username and guess at a password. So if the username that the user types in does exist in the database and the password they typed in matches the password in the database, then I can just return the user. So in the layout file, I've added a couple more links for the login, logout, and I also added the username to the navigation. So now when I log in, I'm redirected to the home page, and I also see the name of my user. And when I log out, the username disappears because I'm no longer logged in. So in step 8, I'm going to persist login sessions in the database. What that means is in step 7, whenever we create a session, that session is stored in the computer memory, and if the server restarts, then the memory's cleared and then all your session information is going to go away. Which means that when the server restarts, all the users will be basically logged out of the site. So in order to prevent losing the sessions when the server restarts, we need to persist them to the database. So if I was using a database that was on a separate server, I would store the sessions inside the database. And if you go to the Express Session site, and they actually list several libraries you can use to save the sessions. And they have different libraries for for a lot of different databases. And they also have libraries that will connect to ORMs such as Connects and SQLize. As I mentioned in previous video, the DB JSON file is actually saved in Git, uploaded to GitHub, and deployed to the server. Because the DB.json file is being deployed to the server, I don't want to keep the session information in DB.json because I don't want the session info from my development environment to be uploaded to the server. So that means I need to use another database to store the session info. And the one I decided to use was for lowdb, and lowdb is a database that stores information in a JSON file, much like lowdb. So to use one of these session stores, what you have to do is install it, pass it the session, and in your session options, you add a store property, and you just create a new store. And for lowdb, you have to tell it what is the file name that you're going to use to store your sessions. In my case, I'm going to store the session information in a file in the data directory called session file, JSON. And because I don't want the session file to be uploaded to the server on deployment, I'm going to ignore that file. And also, I need to add a gnomon JSON file, and I'm going to tell it to ignore the session file. And what this command ignore does is it tells gnomon any files that are listed here, if those files change, ignore them. Do not restart the server. Okay. So now that I'm saving my sessions in a database, then when the server restarts, the user will still remain logged in because that session is stored in the database. So in step 9, I'm going to add flash messages. And what flash messages is it's going to display a message after you submit a form. So for instance, if I go to the login form, then I submit an empty form, I'll see an error message of I didn't add information. Or if I type in bad information, it'll tell me that too. Invalid username, password. And if I log in correctly, it tells me I'm logged in. So in order to have flash messages, I'm going to install a library called Connect Flash. And what Connect Flash is, you can pass in 2 arguments when you create a flash. 1 is the type of argument, and 2, the message. So after I install Flash, I have to initialize it, and I'm also going to add some more variables to my views. One's called error and one's called success. And what error does is it will display all the flash messages that with the error type, and then success will display all the flash messages of the success type. So for my login route, I need to tell it that I want to use Flash, and when success is Flash, I want it to say you're logged in. And also when I log out, I want to do a flag message of success and you're logged out. So in the layout file, I added some code to display the error and success flash messages if they exist. And I also added a handler so that when you click on the flash, it will go away. And now on to step 10, where we're going to restrict the routes based on the logged in state of the user. So at the bottoms of the routes file, I added 2 functions, 2 middleware functions called logged in and is logged out. And what they do is they check whether or not the user is logged in or not, and they'll either let them continue and view a page, or it will redirect them. And they are both using the isAuthenticated method that Passport adds to every request to check whether or not a user is logged in. So in the first function is logged in, what we're saying is if the user is logged in, then continue to the next step, which means continue and execute the function for that route. But if the user isn't logged in, then redirect them to the login page. for the is logged out function, we're saying if the user is not logged in, then continue and execute the function for that route. And if they are logged in, then redirect them to the home page. So we're going to add that to the sign up page and the login page here and here, which means only logged out users can see those two pages. Right now, I can see I'm not logged in, so I can see both the sign up and login pages. So if I type in credentials, I'm logged in. So right now I'm logged in. But if I try to go to the login page, I'm redirected to the home page. And if I try to go up to the sign up page, I'm redirected to the home page. And I also created a profiles route with profiles template that is only viewed by people who are logged in. And on this profile route, I'm grabbing the user object that Passport adds to every request, grabbing the ID, and based on that ID, I'm going to look for that user in the database, and then I'm going to pass that database to the profile template. And then the profile template, I'm going to display two users. I'm going to display the user that comes from the request object from Passport, and I'm going to display the user that's from the database. The profile page, for the request user, I only get the ID and the username, and that's because in the auth service configure Passport deserialized method, I defined what properties are available on the user object, and here I only defined the username and ID. And then in the user from database, I have three properties, which is the user, ID, and password. And now if I log out and try to go back to the profile page, I'm going to be redirected to the login page because in my logged in function, I defined it if the user isn't logged in, redirect them to the login page. And now we can go on to step 11, and in step 11, I'm going to show and hide nav links based on the login state. So instead of always displaying sign up, login, user, login, and logout link, I'm saying if there is a logged in user, show their username and log out. Otherwise, if there isn't a logged in user, show login and sign up. So now when I refresh the page, I should only see the two login and sign up links because I'm not logged in. And now when I log in, I see the username and log out. And this is the end of this walkthrough. Thank you for watching.